Good morning, everyone, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I am Frédéric Armstrong, co-chair in research for the UNESCO Chair in Applied Research for Education in Prison, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third installment in our webinar series on research and innovative practices in education in prison. Once again, we're happy to count on the support of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning and the Institute for Cooperation in Adult Education. We thank them for supporting adult education in general and prison education in particular. Before we move on to today's presentation, I would like to point out a few things. So first, today's presentation will be in English with interpretation available in both French and Spanish. In order to listen to the language of your choice, you must select the correct channel by clicking on the interpretation module on Zoom's interface. You can then choose either Spanish or English or French to have the language of your choice. Secondly, our goal with this webinar series is to provide a space where researchers and practitioners can share their knowledge and insight on education in prison. We also want to allow members of the audience to ask questions and share their thoughts to the panelists. So that's why a significant portion of our time today will be reserved for the Q&A near the end of our time. Having said that, you should feel free to write your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A module on Zoom. Actually, it would be easier for us if you do not wait until the Q&A to write your questions. So we'll try to answer as many questions as we can, and note that you can write your questions in English, Spanish, or French, and we'll take care of the translation for you. Today's webinar is titled Landscape of Higher Education in Prison, Knowledge and Experience in the US Context, and brings together many people from the US who will talk to us about their experience of higher education in prison. First, Aaron Castro, who is Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of Utah and co-founder and co-director of the University of Utah Prison Education Project. Who will be talking with Marie Gould, who's the director of the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison and Associate Professor of Communication at St. Louis University. Then we will have a presentation by Megan Callahan, Dean for Bard Prison Initiative, who will talk with James Kim, who's a Bard Prison Initiative alumnus and Learning Commons and lead, and student recruitment specialist for the Bard Micro College at Brooklyn Public Library. The talk today will be moderated by Jessica Neptune, who's Director of National Engagement for the Bard Prison Initiative at Bard College, and she will moderate the Q&A later and make the transitions between speakers. So without further ado, we can begin the presentation with, I believe, Dr. Aaron Castro.
Hey, good morning, and thank you for being here, and thank you for that kind welcome. My name is Mary Gould. I will be presenting with my colleague, Dr. Aaron Castro. And our presentation today focuses on the landscape of higher education in prison in the United States, particularly efforts to build a data infrastructure for the field of higher education in prison. And we'll be focusing on a collaborative project to engage in data collection, reporting, and evaluation for incarcerated college students. I'd like to thank Genevieve, Marc-Andre, Frederick, and Camille, and all of your colleagues at the UNESCO Chair in Applied Research for Education in Prison for providing us this opportunity. It's a real privilege to be here today talking about the landscape of higher education in prison in the United States, and also presenting with my colleague, Dr. Castro. So just very brief introductions. Aaron Castro is currently the Associate Dean of Community Engagement and Access and Undergraduate Studies at the University of Utah, Associate Professor in Higher Education and Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Utah, and is also the co-founder and former director of the Utah Prison Education Project. I am currently the director of the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison and also an associate professor of communication at St. Louis University and the former director of the St. Louis University Prison Education Project. So we both come to this conversation as researchers in the field of higher education in prison, but also as practitioners. And hopefully that experience of running and leading higher education in prison programs will also come through in the conversation today. So Erin and I will sort of co-present and pass the presentation back and forth to each other today. And Erin, if you want to jump in and begin with perhaps an overview of higher education in prison, how we are approaching higher education in prison in our research efforts.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mary. Thanks for the intro. Good morning, everybody. One of the things that is important to mention in the US context is that incarcerated college students have never been included in federal data collection efforts. And so one of the things we needed to do when we started this project is come up with an actual definition of post-secondary education that would apply in prison contexts. And we have lots of definitions of post-secondary education, but when we think about what constitutes post-secondary education in prisons, there's lots of gray areas. Is it adult education? Is it secondary education? Is it life skills education? Is it sentence mandated education? And so we did a lot of conceptual thinking and looking to other scholars and looking to other countries, and we came up with the following definition, which is a higher education in prison program needs to be kind of formally affiliated with a college or university and provide post-secondary education. And now this might seem perhaps a bit obvious, but we have a lot of diversity in this field. There are a lot of various approaches to providing kind of broad umbrella education in prison. And so it was really important that we distinguished between among all of these various kind of efforts so that we could really start categorizing and counting and doing some advanced data analysis on what is being provided. And then the third kind of credential that we're looking for is that it uses, students have to have some kind of secondary credential. So that has to be a GED or a high school diploma. And I will just say that there are a handful of states where this requirement is not required, the ability to benefit. And so we honor that as well. And so if you're in a state where, you know, you might have graduated 40 years ago and you don't have a high school diploma, there's no evidence, you can still attend college. We still count that. We kind of go to the state law to support that. The kind of second thing we needed to do was do some mapping. The higher ed and prison landscape, just by nature of how programs started, the kind of lack of infrastructure, the kind of various different ways that folks approach this work, we needed to have a really clear understanding of how does a college and prison program organizationally function? And here is just a very, very basic conceptual map of how a higher education and prison program kind of starts at a university. There tends to be a kind of a program, a collection of people who are invested in the work. And then we have actual physical sites that are off-site from the college or university. In this example, this is a college and prison program that's going into 2 prisons. And then below that, we kind of see what is offered, certain courses, particular supplemental programming engagement, right? And then we get to the student. And the reason that this map is really important is because there are all these layers between kind of understanding student metrics and student experiences and what happens at the institutional level. And so this, I would say, is probably a basic map, but just know, and I think my BARD colleagues can attest to this as well, these maps tend to be very complicated because you have multiple institutions, you have folks in multiple prisons, you've got, you know, students getting kind of just online education sometimes. So these maps can be very, very complex.
Thank you, Erin. I'm going to continue to move us on and talk a little bit about one specific project, the Higher Education in Prison Landscape Project. This project is a collaboration between the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison, the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Utah Prison Education Project. This project does include an interactive online database of higher education in prison programs, and the URL for that site is at the bottom of this page. We'll look at a few screen captures of this project throughout the presentation, but you're also invited to look at the webpage for the more interactive version of the project. So as Erin is beginning to describe, part of our work at the start of this project was collecting descriptive data and really building a data infrastructure for the field of higher education in prison. Often I start these conversations by also including that, or making sure that it's clear that this data infrastructure and even descriptive data on higher education in prison programs really was non-existent in the field of higher education in prison in the United States. There was an effort that began in 2008, 2009 at Harvard University in the Prison Studies Project to start documenting the existence of higher education in prison programs. And we worked closely with that group to integrate the data that they had collected over about 10 years and include that data into this one national landscape project. But really the effort just to know where programs were, who was running programs, how many students were engaged in programs, had really not been done at a national level. So part of our efforts, and here described in sort of three components, first began with an annual survey. The annual survey data, which was distributed to directors of higher education in prison programs, collected descriptive information on programming. That data was collected beginning in March of 2019 and folded into the National Directory, which is now the online database. And we are particularly interested in the relationships between higher education and prison programs and the affiliated institutions of higher education. You'll see there's some statistics here, and we'll go over some highlights a little bit later in this presentation, but currently we are counting 374 higher education and prison programs with 371 institutional partnerships. At the same time that we launched the survey and began building the National Directory, we also launched a cohort program so that we could work in collaboration with higher education and prison programs and engage in co-learning and having a cohort of programs that were available to us to ask questions and participate in the reviews of the annual survey in the National Directory. And this included a representative sample of higher education in prison programs from across the country, two-year schools, four-year institutions, third-party facilitators, and at least one Department of Corrections. And so, as well as Erin is describing, often the initiator of a higher education in prison program in the United States is not a singular monolithic type of institution. Some goals and outcomes of the Higher Education in Prison Landscape Project. We were particularly interested in filling what we considered a data gap in the field, which is to understand program level data. So where the programs were located, who was running programs, the curriculum offered, the number of students. We continue to realize that the efforts to fill the data gap at the program level was also suggesting the lack of student level data. And Erin will talk a bit about the second phase of this project, which does focus on student level data. So student enrollment, persistence, completion, which we know in higher education are critical data to understanding student success. We also continue to believe that these metrics are essential to developing indicators of quality, equity, and student success, which we know are vital to understand, in particular in the context of in-prison education, because we are working with a vulnerable population of students. And so ensuring quality and equity for students is imperative. And additionally, being able to contribute to thinking around best practices for the field of higher education in prison. So these continue to be goals of this project. We're now going into our third year of launching survey data, and we continue to ask some of the very same questions, which is where are the programs, what are the programs in the field, what's being offered. So just to give you a very quick, again, snapshot overview of the National Directory, there are three predominant ways that you can view data: the stats view, a map view, and a list view. And I'll just move through these relatively quickly and invite participants to visit the directory website and move through the data visualization efforts here. The statistics view, as you will see, provides a state-by-state overview of programs, and a deeper dive into clicking on each one of these programs can take you into a mapping view, which I'm showing the state of New York here. We're tracking both institutions of higher education as well as penal facilities. So you can see the relationship, a spatial relationship between the facilities and the programs. And then in the directory, the program overview, where take, for example, the Cornell Prison Education Program, where you'll find data such as their mission, contact information, academic institutions. So again, I think this is a good example of one higher education institution that is partnering with 5 other academic institutions to work in 4 facilities with 1 certificate, 2 degree programs. So again, you start to get a sense of how these programs are being divided up and become collaborations between institutions of higher education as well as prison facilities. And then we'll dig a little deeper into the data, and we get a breakdown by facility of the number of students, the type of programming, the mode of engagement, whether it's face-to-face, online, annual enrollment, admission cycles. So again, you start to get a sense of some of the data that we're collecting. And I'll leave this part of the first phase of the project by just giving you a really brief snapshot of the current landscape and current data that we have collected as a result of the survey for the 2019-2020 academic year, of course, with the caveat that we launched this survey in March. We were well into the pandemic at this point. And so we've also obviously had many shifts in the ways in which education programming is being delivered at this point. But I'll leave this slide up for just a minute so you can get a sense of the data that we are tracking. And Erin, I'm gonna turn this over to you to talk about the second phase of the project and looking at student level data collection.
Thanks, Mary. So I do think it's important just to provide a bit of context here. In the US, colleges and universities report federally if they receive federal funding. And so they do annual reports on all sorts of characteristics and engagements and programs of study for their students. The challenge at this point is that incarcerated students are not identifiable in the data right now. So if a college or university reports that they had an incoming freshman class, let's say, of 5,000 students, at a federal level right now, we aren't able to discern what percentage of those enrollments are for currently incarcerated people. And so what we're trying to do in the second phase of the project is not reinvent the wheel, but to kind of provide some evidence-based information to the Department of Education to augment some of their data collection practices and some of the supports that they provide colleges and universities so that we can finally see some of the kind of enrollment, completion, persistent patterns that we would see with any other college student. You can skip this one, Mary. So for this second phase of the project, we're working with 12 college and prison programs across the US and their affiliated academic institutions, which I think is really important to mention. And so this means that institutional research offices are on board, Office of Registrar, admission, financial aid are on board, so that we can get a better understanding of how at an institutional level, the main actors think about and report on both internally and externally their incarcerated college students. And so very briefly, we're really interested in kind of how, if at all, colleges and universities are collecting internal information on incarcerated students. And we've been doing a version of this work for the past 3 years. It's all over the map right now. You have some colleges and universities that have robust infrastructure and they have the resources to do this. You have other colleges and universities where if we were to ask, can you give us some longitudinal data of the last 4 years on some basic student level metrics, it'd be a pretty heavy lift for them right now. So what we see is a lot of diversity in the field and a need for some kind of general guidance and infrastructure support. The integrated post-secondary education data system, which is a kind of function of the National Center for Education Statistics. We're curious the extent to which this kind of body provides guidance to colleges and universities right now in reporting incarcerated students. There's a lot to unpack there. So if folks have questions in the Q&A, happy to jump in. The third question is one that we know the answer to. We know that it's yes. Are incarcerated students influencing enrollment, persistent, and completion numbers? We know this. And the BARD folks can kind of attest to this too, particularly those institutions that are part of the Federal Experimental Sites Initiative. But at this point in time, we aren't able to kind of systematically discern to what extent that's happening. And that's a problem. It's a problem on all sorts of levels. It's also a problem when we think about the kinds of experiences that incarcerated students might be having in these programs. And then finally, we're really interested in kind of what the ethical implications are here in student tracking. And so for those of us who work in higher ed, we know that there are all sorts of internal systems where students can get flagged, where we can use site codes, where there are all sorts of kind of various ways that we could identify someone's incarcerated status. And once we do that, we have to have a conversation about how that information is used. And so we're curious to learn from these 12 schools, what are they doing? What needs do they have? What information would be helpful for them as we think about these recommendations? So one of the things that I think implicitly is kind of surfacing in Mary's intro is, why do this? Why do this work? If we're thinking about 372 programs and, in the broad landscape of higher ed and of higher education in the US, we have close to 6,000 Title IV, colleges and universities. I think one of the biggest things for us is an issue of equity and quality. So right now, we can't really get a sense on the kinds of experiences that students are having when they're incarcerated and enrolled in college. While we have anecdotal data, we don't have kind of broad systematic data. And because incarcerated students are not afforded college choice, they're not afforded the autonomy to make decisions around what is available to them, it becomes increasingly urgent to be able to get some information about how folks are doing this work. Are there stipulations and regulations we should be following? The answer is yes. What are those, et cetera? We do know in the US that this is a population that's growing. I mean, we started doing this work 6 years ago, and we had fewer than 100 programs, and now we're close to 400, and I'm certain that's an undercount with the federal Pell Grant becoming widely available in a year and a half. we will see more colleges and universities engage this work. And so we are at a time where establishing a baseline of data collection is really important. I'm going to skip down to the kind of current practices at this point. Those of you who are kind of data nerds can identify right away that this is secondary data collection that we're doing. And there are all sorts of credibility issues that come with that. And so really what we want to do is fold incarcerated students into the already existing federal reporting kind of mechanisms. We can certainly still collect program level data. We can still do all this important work. But the goal of this second phase is to really, we should be thinking about incarcerated college students as college students, period. And if that's what we're doing, then we have to have mechanisms to accurately track their progress. This last one, I don't know how this works in other countries, but here in the US, the prison population is a target population for what we call predatory practices. So, targeting vulnerable populations, charging questionable tuition rates, providing substandard quality programming. And there is no real oversight here to doing that. And so it's not like we can, just say stop. And so one of the ways we want to try to also kind of insert ourselves here is to try to discourage that kind of practice and to educate corrections and to educate other colleges and universities about how to identify those practices and to how to maybe nudge them out of the way. Mary, is this me? I'm assuming it's me. You're not on video. Okay, please. So what's at stake? What are we thinking about? Equity, first and foremost. Disproportionate number of people of color and Black people, folks with disabilities, folks with intergenerational trauma, right? They are the people who are filling our prisons at this point. So we're not just talking about like some random slice of the population here. We're talking about a systematically disenfranchised sector of the population and their access to post-secondary education. So it needs to be high quality. It needs to be the best of the best. We need to understand kind of how this is working. And without that kind of attention, we are kind of running the risk of, the kind of continued disenfranchisement of folks who kind of don't have access to make the decisions about their own post-secondary education. So I feel like there's a lot of responsibility at stake here. We talked a little bit about the ethical considerations. We know that this is new terrain for many colleges and universities. And so, what can we do around professional development, about education and training? If you're an academic advisor and you're meeting with someone who has an incarceration history, right? What is the response? Where can that academic advisor go to access information and resources to provide that student the best experience possible? We talked about expansion considerations. We're at a place right now where, projections say with the kind of release of Pell funds that this could explode. And if we look at the last 3 to 4 years, we are on an upward trajectory of college and prison programming really growing. And so getting ahead of this is really important now. And then finally, just issues of quality. For so long, my dear colleague Mary says, we would just put in, whatever we can. Something's better than nothing, right, when it comes to prison ed. And I think the panelists today will all tell you that that's just not the way that we should be operating. And there's no reason why we have to operate that way. That's it, Mary. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. And we look forward to your questions and the conversation. I think, Jessica, I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Erin, and also thank you to our hosts at the UNESCO Chair. I'm Jessica Neptune, and I am the Director of National Engagement at the Barred Prison Initiative, and we'll be moderating today. And we'll just taking a moderator's prerogative for a moment before we get to the next presentation to say first that I think you probably get the sense, if you're not already familiar with the American landscape, that Mary and Aaron are really at the forefront of research nationally within the United States, but also of creating a community across practitioners in the United States, and really have been at the forefront of making a field of higher education in prison legible. And you may have gotten a sense from the presentation that there's a feeling that we're sort of in a moment of a watershed, that there's been huge growth in the United States. And I'm a historian by training. So again, just taking a moment of prerogative as the moderator, I wanted to just give a little bit of historical context between the panel that we just had, which really gave you a sense of what the landscape looks like now broadly, to going to a deep dive into one program, the Bard Prison Initiative. And just to sort of say that, the history of mass incarceration in the United States and the history of college and prison are deeply intertwined. Many of you probably know that what we call mass incarceration is basically a phenomenon where we went from roughly 200,000 people in prison in the United States in 1970 to more than 2 million by the turn of the century. And as that happened, ironically, as we got more and more punitive and built more and more prisons and sent people to prison for longer periods of time, often at younger and younger ages, the existence of Pell Grants also meant that during that same time, colleges began to work in prisons around the country. And so for a number of years, as prisons were expanding and as the importance of the prison on the landscape of the United States became so dominant, there were colleges in roughly every prison around the country. But the punitive politics in the United States led to a very vicious crime bill, national crime bill in 1994, that eliminated access to federal Pell Grants, which was one of the main ways that there was public funding going into supporting college and prison around the country. And as Pell Grants were taken away, states around the country followed the federal lead and rescinded state level public funding as well. And so college and prison programs around the country shut down in the mid 1990s. And there was very, very little college and higher education of any kind happening in prisons. As we get to the very tip of the water of the height of mass incarceration and the growth of our carceral system. And so the Bard Prison Initiative started in that early landscape of there being very, very little college happening. And so as we move now into this moment where Pell Grants are back, as students who are incarcerated are eligible for Pell Grants, again, that law passed in 2020 and will come into being in 2023. Again, we're in a very, very different place now than when the Bard Prison Initiative started 20 years ago. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues, Megan Callahan and James Kim, and have them introduce themselves and jump into what this one program looks like.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much. We're really honored to be here. And I also wanted to thank the interpreters for their work today. I'm Megan Callahan. I'm Dean of the Bard Prison Initiative. I come to Bard College. I came in 2005 to teach in the anthropology program, just having finished my doctoral dissertation on young people and community policing in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And like many members of the faculty, I taught a class and then another class for BPI. In 2012, I moved over full-time to BPI as a member of the faculty and administration, and I now lead a team of faculty and staff who are responsible for Bard College at 7 prison locations and 4 locations outside of prison.
All right, thank you, Megan. Hello, everyone. My name is James, and I'll provide some background information about myself, and hopefully this will help you understand how I came to be involved with college and prison and about my association with the Bard Prison Initiative. In 2001, I was sentenced to a prison term of 20 years, which, as Jessica mentioned, was kind of at the peak of mass incarceration in the United States. At the time, BPI was just starting out, and it didn't offer classes at the prison I was assigned to. Eventually, BPI did expand to my facility, and in 2008, I applied to the college and I've been involved with BPI ever since. I was fortunate to be released from prison in November 2020, and I received my bachelor's degree through BPI in 2021 after submitting a senior thesis on immigration in the United States. Currently, I'm working with BPI as a lead tutor and student recruitment specialist attached to the New York City Micro College program in Brooklyn, New York. Oh, Megan, you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you, James. The Bard Prison Initiative has been working with students in New York State for over 20 years. And for about half that time, we've also been working with other colleges and universities interested in starting or expanding college and prison. As we have those conversations, we always begin with the idea that college and prison should be an extension of the same colleges and universities outside of prison. So if we start from that premise that BPI is Bard College, what does that mean? It means that students are Bard students, they enroll in Bard courses, they earn Bard degrees. Academic engagement is full-time and in-person. Students are held to the same academic standards and they have access to the instruction materials and support they need in order to reach those standards. These are essential elements of the commitment the college makes to students and the commitment required of students. So James and I are going to get into some of the ways that this plays out, and I just wanted to start with a few things we're not saying. First, we're not saying that you shouldn't start the work until you're ready to deliver a degree program representative of the curricular breadth of your college or university. We assume that's just a good way never to get started. So this timeline illustrates BPI's development over time, and it is intended to make the point that we didn't start with a fully formed bachelor's degree program. Most often, it makes sense to start small, and we just like to suggest that as programs start small, they think about how they're going to grow. So they keep open those paths to making sure that we continually work to become more and more representative of our college or university. Second, we're not saying that Bard students in prison come from privileged educational backgrounds and that is why they succeed in Bard College courses. As other people have already mentioned, the United States has a high level of educational stratification. Our educational institutions have historically excluded or limited resources for students of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students. In this country, there's a well-documented correlation between structural racism in schooling and the structural racism of mass incarceration. The majority of people in prison in New York State are Black and Latinx men, as are the majority of BPI students. And most BPI students did not graduate high school before they were incarcerated. However, in New York State, if you are incarcerated and do not have a high school diploma or equivalency, you are required to take high school level classes while you are in prison. So the majority of BPI students passed high school equivalency exams after taking these classes. When students first enroll with BPI, they come in with all different kinds of educational experience and preparation. And it's obviously common practice that universities administer placement tests and often require students to take not-for-credit remedial courses until they can demonstrate that they're ready for college. We take a different approach. When students enter the college, they enroll directly into credit-bearing college courses, and we assume that as faculty, it's our responsibility to teach and provide resources so that students can learn what they need in order to succeed. So students enroll full-time, they're earning credit, and they're also at the same time learning foundational academic skills. We put a lot of emphasis in particular on our first-year writing and mathematics curriculum, And students take those first-year courses together as a cohort, which becomes the basis for creating community, mutual support, and leadership.
Yeah, so I was in the cohort model, and like many of the other members of my cohort, at the time I started taking college in courses in prison, I had no experience with college at all. I mean, I really didn't know what to expect in a college. And I think looking back, that was a good thing. I mean, one of the benefits of getting an education through a program like BPI, I mean, despite the harsh prison environment, was that I felt I was stepping into a different culture, one that stood in kind of stark contrast to prison itself. And it was a place I could start fresh without the weight of past mistakes. I mean, it was difficult to learn in prison, but I got to learn in a community of peers and with professors and other educators that expected a high level of work from me and the other students. And it was encouraging. I mean, I worked hard because the classwork demanded it, not because I was ordered to by a prison official or a guard or commanded to by the courts. I also worked hard because I saw firsthand how hard my fellow students were working. And as students in a cohort, any difficulties we had were made easier because we could rely on each other as well as on the support provided by the college. So with the Barred Prison Initiative, we're not at all denying that college and prison happens in a setting that has severe inherent limitations. For example, BPI offers biology classes without labs, linear algebra and calculus courses without graphing calculators, and computer science courses without access to the internet. We do have a computer lab in each prison where we operate, but no internet. Instead, students have individual accounts and can access materials loaded onto a central server that is housed inside the prison. Students also have access to library databases and can do research, but the research material they request must be approved by prison staff and delivered in person. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not always possible to guarantee that these things will be easily provided to students. Still, what we do have are committed students, lively discussions, rigorous classes, as well as a consistent educational practice. And this consistency, despite the limitations of running college classes in a place like prison, is what makes us feel as though we're in a college no different from any other college outside of prison. And of course, adjustments must be made, but those adjustments are always made in a way that's motivated by a desire for consistency with the main campus. On the screen, you will see a few course descriptions that give a sense of the work students undertake in BPI. This coursework is identical to what is offered at the main campus of Bard College. There's nothing in the courses themselves or the work demanded in these courses that mark them as different from what goes on in a college outside of prison. The professors are the same professors that teach on the main campus. The reading and the assignments are the same. And so it should really come as no surprise that the work accomplished is of the same quality as any other college.
So what are we saying then when we say that BPI is Bard College? First, we think that the college absolutely must maintain responsibility for academic decision-making, which applies to admissions, enrollment, course content, academic evaluation, and degree completion. It does this in a place and a context where it ultimately does not have authority and where there are always constraints, but it holds that responsibility nevertheless, and it values it the way it would outside of prison. Secondly, the college must recognize students as full members of the college community, not as the recipients of outreach or service by people who are understood to be the real members of the college community. And just as on any other campus, these students are going to have ideas, push the institution in new directions, and eventually assume leadership roles, which obviously further enriches the college. As an example, BPI students have initiated programs in public health, food production, languages, computer science, education, debate, and the list could continue. And third, when we're thinking about academic systems and institutions, we should work to strengthen connections between college and prison and those same colleges and systems outside of prison. And this is consistent with Aaron's argument that reporting for students who are incarcerated be consistent and integrated into other kinds of college reporting systems. The same is true for systems of accreditation and everything that's already in place to make sure that colleges are upholding their responsibilities to their students. Now it's my turn to point to the mute.
I apologize. So as Megan explained, BPI students start in cohorts and they take a lot of required courses in the first year or two. As they move further along, they begin choosing their own classes and areas of study as they refine their academic interests. Some students complete an associate's degree as their final degree, and others continue on to a bachelor's degree. In total, Bard College has awarded over 700 degrees through BPI. For the bachelor's degree, this means choosing a major and completing a senior thesis. On the left, you can see some recent senior thesis titles produced by BPI students. Completing a senior thesis is a Bard College requirement, not just a college and prison requirement. It's something that every Bard graduate, regardless of what campus they're on, must do in order to receive a bachelor's degree. Academically, the project serves as a culmination of a student's entire college career. It's rigorous, it's difficult. Students routinely submit 100 pages or more of finely researched original scholarship. As an example, on the right, you can see a publication by Rodney Spivey Jones. He's an alum who turned his thesis into an article that the A-Line Journal is publishing this year in 2 parts. Spivey Jones's work is not just a good piece of prison college writing. His work is excellent scholarship in any setting.
And of course, when we think of a college experience, it's not just about coursework. So BPI also maintains co-curricular and extracurricular activities, which include student-operated vegetable gardens, math and language workshops, peer tutoring, guest lectures, concerts, and the debate union, which has gotten some international attention. So I included some photographs here. The bottom photograph is from the debate against Harvard, which got quite a bit of attention in the press, but I'm particularly excited to include the photograph on the top left, which was just taken this past December. This was a debate against Morehouse College, and it was the first large event that we were able to hold since the start of the pandemic. We have been offering classes in person for the entire fall semester and are just about to start the spring semester. And this was an opportunity to hold an event that felt a little bit like returning to what we like to do.
And beyond offering just classes in prison, BPI also works with students and alumni as they leave prison and go on to further educational programs, as well as start businesses and establish careers. As activists, our students and alumni are contributing to legislative and social change in their own communities. Our alumni are also successful business owners, and many are pursuing graduate degrees. So in this way, the college has grown into kind of this amazing community, both inside and outside of the prison walls. And that community of some 700 alumni is by far BPI's biggest strength. They provide resources for one another greater than what the institution itself could do. There are currently 8 alumni in full-time positions on BPI staff working at all levels of the program. As BPI has grown to include many of the co- and extracurricular offerings Megan previously mentioned, it has also extended positions to alumni as the program expands. And I think it's important to understand that BPI engages its work as part of a larger effort to address educational inequity and expand access to liberal arts education to those who have been systematically denied this type of education. And in this spirit, 6 years ago, we launched the Bard Micro College to do the work of addressing educational inequity outside of prison as well. Each Bard Micro College is a partnership between BPI and one or more institutions based in a particular community and committed to educational justice within that community. Micro college students, much like BPI students, do not pay tuition, and they join a student body that includes formerly incarcerated students and staff, some of whom started degrees with BPI while in prison and are now finishing those degrees after release in their own community. And finally, BPI also operates a tuition scholarship program for adults 24 years and older on the main campus of Bard College in upstate New York. This is called the Bard Back, and it's one way that BPI and micro-college students continue their studies and obtain bachelor's degrees after release. So, as stated earlier, at BPI, we look forward to working with colleges and universities who want to do this type of work themselves. This includes conversations throughout the year that seek to develop a community of practice and practitioners, all committed to offering college and prison. This collaborative work happens most intensively, though, through our summer residency, which takes place in the second half of July. And the summer residency is an intensive cohort-based sequence that takes residents under the hood, so to speak, for hands-on and experiential workshops that explore the hows, the whys, and the whats of BPI's particular approach to college and prison. And it's often followed by more technical conversations about the mechanics and strategies of building a robust, ambitious, and successful college and prison program, both here in the United States as well as in other countries. And for more information on that, if anyone is interested in learning more about the residency, you can contact us at bardbpi.edu.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Megan. I'm going to invite all of the panelists to turn their cameras on as we turn to the Q&A portion. I've been watching the questions come in, and we've got a bunch, and they range from sort of technical and empirical questions to more philosophical. I'm going to start with a couple that are just a little bit more context-based, and then get into some of the sort of philosophical ethos kind of approaches, and also, of course, try to answer some more of the technical and empirical questions. But to start with, and this is for everybody, so please, whoever wants to jump in, and then others, please join. I'm going to combine two. This is sort of context questions or about the United States and sort of political landscape. One is, how do prison authorities in the United States perceive participation in higher education? Do they think of it as a right or a privilege or otherwise? And the other is asking about political allegiances in different states and how that varies state to state. So that maybe start with Mary and Aaron, but I think the question, both of those questions of how things vary and how it looks kind of within the prison, I'd like to hear from BPI as well.
Go for it, Mary.
All right, I can start, and if you want to jump in. I would say the maybe just to start with the political landscape, and I know, Jessica, you asked about state to state. I would even say it's facility to facility. I think facilities across states have different approaches, and sometimes that is simply because of the discretion of who works there, the warden, what a particular facility's experience has been with education. I would say, and maybe this is just an effort to acknowledge the distinction in purpose between higher education and prison, and perhaps a philosophy of correctional education, or even the political philosophy or educational philosophy of a prison. Recidivism, the rate of return often in the United States is shorthand for did someone return to prison within 3 to 5 years, is often a driving factor for departments of corrections, that their explicit mission is to ensure that people do not return to prison. And education, in a lot of cases, is seen as part of that effort and part of that mission, or even part of the safety and security mission of the facility. It is a narrative that practitioners, teachers, even students really try to push against within the field, and ensuring that recidivism is not necessarily seen as an outcome of our work. That certainly we hope that students do not return to prison. We hope that people do not go to prison. Sure. And also recidivism is not an educational outcome. That is not the purpose of higher education in prison. So really what I'm trying to frame is that there are very base level philosophical differences between the purpose and intention of higher education in prison, and often the purpose and intention of incarceration, prison administration. So maybe I'll just leave that there to frame out at least one political distinction that really does become a challenge for programs, and leave it open to Aaron, Megan, or James to jump in.
I have no other comments on that. Nice work.
I suppose I could speak just quickly on it because as a former student, or I guess I'm a lifelong student, this framing of college and prison as a sort of a corrective to all these social ills. And it's often a way to generate kind of support for college and prison programs. But my experience with BPI, and one of the things I appreciate about the particular education I got, was that it was never kind of billed as some type of therapeutic program. I mean, inmates, as they're called in the New York State system, not prisoners, inmates are quick to sniff out kind of the paternalistic, we're going to make you better type of narrative. And this was always billed as education itself. It was really up to us to kind of, kind of integrate it into our lives, right? And I think that in the long run made for a much more robust program because people didn't come at it with any suspicions that this was some type of, grand thing, right?
I think also inherent in the question around the politics at the prison level is always the assumption that that there's a major resistance at the prison to college. And in my experience, that isn't always the biggest barrier to getting a program started. What are the big barriers, or the most important things that colleges have to kind of develop, overcome, plan for?
I'll speak to some of our experiences here in Utah. I think the challenges that prisons face influence our ability to consistently get inside. So for example, the Utah Department of Corrections cannot retain employees. So there is a massive staff shortage, which means that, we've got teachers teaching classes and halfway through an officer comes in and says everybody's leaving because we don't have coverage. And so I think one of the things that becomes really apparent is that when the prison is, experiencing some of these broader organizational challenges, we get folded into whatever those are. Right now with COVID, I think is another great example, but I'm in a state that has really politicized COVID. And so we now have a mandate that you cannot mandate masks. And we're in a program where we will not go in without masks, right? And so it's like some of these things that just end up coming up because of the environment that we're in, we end up having to deal with right away.
A question for BPI, and thinking about models. This person is asking, there's a interesting contrast between the BPI model and the inside out model, where incarcerated students share classes with people coming in from the outside. Granted, both are good models. I'm interested to know whether BPI students express a preference for their model, or would they appreciate sharing courses with people from the outside? Do you think the latter would actually hinder the sense of community that BPI fosters? Megan, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we think of how the BPI thinks about the cohorts that James and you described, and this question of students coming in and what the considerations have been over the years.
Sure. So in terms of cohort, when we use that term, I think it's shorthand for us for a lot of different things that go on around community building and around the strength of the college community within these prison settings. And so students are taking classes together in their first year, and then as they continue on beyond their first year of college, they're taking classes, electives that they choose, and they're taking classes with students who may have started in other years or even at other prisons. In terms of students from the campus outside of prison attending class with students inside prison, although we don't do that, we do have quite a lot of engagement through tutoring. So students, BARD students can take pedagogy courses, learn how to become tutors, and they can do that work on campus or in the prisons. And the tutors who are taking those classes and being trained, some of them are themselves incarcerated and others are not incarcerated. So the peer tutoring is a mix of students who are attending college outside of prison and students who are attending college inside of prison. And I think that's been very important to our program. And however, I think what's critically important to me is that when we are operating our degree program, the students who I am responsible for, or not, I'm responsible for the college degree programs, those are students who are in prison, and those are not, those students are not kind of participating in the college as a form of engagement for students who are outside of prison. So I don't think that it's necessarily whether or not students from outside of prison are coming in, that's the question. I think the question is, how do we understand what they're doing when they're coming in? And how do we understand our commitment to students who happen to be in prison? And to me, that's the fundamental issue, rather than whether or not there's people coming in from the outside. James, part of the question had to do with student preference. So did you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for all students, but I can say that there is a strong sense of identity with the program, and that identity exists within the prison itself. But it also extends outside. Like we do, as Megan mentioned, have a lot of extracurricular activities like debates. We've had joint classes with or joint events and lectures. And, it's knowing that we're kind of getting our education in a certain way, in a certain setting, that's not constantly disrupted by, I guess, other considerations, allows us to form both community and identity in ways that really shine through. Like you should see our cheer squad for our debates. We're pretty fierce about BPI itself as a program. So yeah, I think students don't necessarily feel at a loss because they're not taking classes with, so-called conventional students, college students. We understand that our education is, no different really. We're just doing it in a kind of different way. Hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Yes. Mary and Aaron, I wanted to ask a couple questions about data that are coming up. And we're going to combine two again. One is about the political implications of data collection and how policymakers may or may not use the findings. And the other is interested in the ways data might identify or prevent predatory practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the tensions in this work is that, for a very long time, programs had to work under the radar. We've got states still where programs are very hesitant to share data with the Landscape Project because of potential political backlash. And our overall goal is we want the program to continue. I'll speak for myself, as a higher ed scholar, I do think we are running a great risk of disservice when we don't capture incarcerated students. And so I do think there's a way to do so that allows for all the kind of benefits that incarcerated college students deserve, which are oftentimes based on data, right? So we know performance funding, for example, at the state level is oftentimes disseminated based on completion data. Well, if you're an institution, and I'm looking at some of these questions in the chat, if you're an institution that at this point is exceeding the federal limit of 25% Pell Grant recipients for incarcerated students, for example, it could appear as if your institution is serving a disproportionate number of veterans, a disproportionate number of students of color, a disproportionate number of students with disabilities. And that's not true. What it is it's offering, online courses to, 20 prisons, and that work is not happening on campus. And so I think there are certainly trade-offs, but what I would argue is that as long as incarcerated students continue to be an invisible student population, they will be subject to whatever we consider to be, good enough for that population. And so I do think that they must be included if we're going to legitimize this work. And then in terms of the predatory practices, I think part of the challenge at this point is many of us who are practitioners can speak for days about the presence of predatory schools. I will say in Utah, it is rampant. And these are out-of-state schools, and these are schools with questionable accreditation statuses. So in the US, we have a number of agencies who can accredit, but there are agencies that are better than others. And what we run into is that, departments of corrections are not experts in higher ed accreditation. And so, when they sign off and they allow some of these schools to come in, I know one school in particular here in Utah that has a great degree of access. Well, it's not regionally accredited. It's nationally accredited, and it's an obscene amount of money, and it's all self-paced. And so I think we've got a lot of education to do for corrections, but also just in general I certainly want folks to have opportunities, but if somebody pays an exorbitant amount of money and then finds out that none of their credits transfer to an institution, that's poor practice. And on the kind of extreme side, that's also kind of targeted disenfranchisement. And so I think understanding the institutions that are involved in this space, what they're offering, how they're doing it is critical to being able to identify how many proprietary institutions and those with questionable accreditation statuses are in the space, and kind of big efforts to reduce their presence in this space.
I think maybe, and just to add to that, and on the question of sort of the intentions of our efforts at data collection, not just related to policy, but also related to research in the field. There's a lot of research that is needed in the field of higher education in prison to understand not just how programs run, but how programs are assessed, program evaluation, how the offerings that students are receiving, how finances work in this field. We didn't talk about one of probably the great barriers to access to higher education in prison are financial resources. I'm not just talking about the uses and also abuses of Pell funding for students, but also the ways in which institutions of higher education are funding and supporting programs. But there's just so much to understand about this work. And so part of our efforts in even collecting the descriptive data, and then for the future, trying to inform national efforts to collect student level data is to encourage research. We make our data set freely available to anyone who's interested in using it to engage in research. And yes, also to the question in the chat, to inform policy. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence. There is a lot of personal narrative evidence in this field. We're hoping to have the data from the work that we are doing contribute to the existing experiences, the existing narratives of higher education in prison, to create a more robust picture of this work. So I think both on the policy front and the research front, we are trying to make a contribution to a more full and robust picture of higher education in prison.
Thank you both. There are a lot of questions around online access, sort of virtual classes and technology. So I was hoping first if Erin and Mary could give us a sense of what the landscape looks like, how many programs have access to the internet or do online work or are virtual. And then if Megan can jump in, and Erin too, to talk a little bit about navigating, particularly during the pandemic, questions around technology, and just thinking about what that means for programs, thinking about those are, you both represent in-person programs and how you think about technology in the context of those in-person programs.
Yeah, Mary, I'll let you chat to overall knowledge at this point, but I think it's really important to point out that in this space, what I have found is we conflate so much when we say technology and internet and right. So there's this idea that an incarcerated college student can come sit down at a computer lab and like check email. The rate at which that is happening is minuscule. What tends to happen for folks who are able to get access to some kind of computer, a tablet, a laptop during incarceration is that they are participating in what we would call a self-paced, asynchronous learning experience. And so, there are models that kind of download onto some kind of server, and then the student can upload that, and then they take it and kind of. Very rarely have we found that incarcerated students are able to participate in synchronous instruction. So that would be through a learning management system, kind of live broadcast. We have seen some where, somebody can kind of pull up a video that is live, but for the most part, what we have found is that that is not happening. You have certain instances where that can happen, and that tends to be built on some pretty strong relationships between the college program and the prison. But in general, this is a really kind of frustrating area for practitioners. And we figure out all sorts of ways to try to work around prison requirements to get students access, not just to content, but access to a laptop, right? Access to being able to type, access to being able to, understand what Canvas is and create a PowerPoint and all of these things. And so I would just say kind of from a kind of landscape perspective, we are nowhere near where we need to be to provide incarcerated people access to the 21st century tools that they would need to be successful post-release as it relates to navigating the online world, basic technology, how to work a mouse, things like that.
Yeah, so I think maybe this framing of technology as a tool, which we would say is critical for all students, versus technology as a mode of engagement. For our efforts in the data collection, we do ask questions. We ask questions about both. We're interested in the resources that are available to students. We see that as part of a student support services initiative. What are you providing to students to help them be successful students? So computer labs, computers for writing papers, printers. But we also ask questions about mode of engagement and distance or remote broadcast correspondence all fall into these questions around mode of engagement. We're tracking a very few number of specifically online programs, but where we come to sort of a disproportionate data representation is the amount of students that are being served by online. So we see, at least for our efforts, and we should say, like, our efforts, we would always describe them as known programs. So there are programs that we do not know about and that we are not tracking, but we're tracking a small amount of online programs with very large numbers of students, which also makes sense. And again, we get to potentially some of the predatory practices at play in higher education in prison, where students who have very little choice about where they will enroll are making choices based upon a scarcity model. And we know in a scarcity model, you choose what's available, regardless of the potential quality or opportunity that it provides you. So these are things that we are very concerned about in the field. But I also just want to make the distinction, and I know Megan and James will talk about sort of the ways in which programs have had to pivot over the past couple of years and provide educational opportunities to continue their programming during a global pandemic. We've also seen some great emergences of technology in facilities where for years facilities were saying, we can't have Zoom, we can't have the internet, and all of a sudden over the past couple of years, we've started to see more advances in technology. So maybe, I'm sure, Megan, you can talk about this a lot more. And I know you all have done so much work around access and technology over the past couple of years.
Well, I find that distinction really helpful, the idea of technology as a tool versus technology as a mode of engagement. And so I'm gonna use that in my comments as well. And you know, James already described the work that we put into building computer labs in each of the prisons where we operate. We offer computer science coursework. Students have individual student accounts, which means that they can save and return to work that they're doing. We put learning resources, articles and data sets and other things like that onto the computer servers. So we deeply invest in technology as part of students' college education. And then on the other hand, we are deeply skeptical of technology as becoming the primary mode of engagement with students. During the first 14 to 15 months of the pandemic, we couldn't enter the prisons, and so we had to find ways of continuing to run semesters without being there in person. And we used everything that was available to us to a point. We did so intentionally to create temporary replacements, temporary solutions, but we did not want to create a precedent that would prevent us from returning to in-person, or that would make it kind of we could picture a kind of easy slide into doing the easier version of things, which frankly, you know, if you can sit at a computer, it's easier than trying to take people and materials into the prison. So we wanted to avoid that, and we also spoke with students and asked them to, rather than kind of a standard course and faculty evaluation form, which we would normally do every semester during that 15 months when we couldn't be teaching in person, we asked them to kind of do a more extensive feedback survey about what their experience of learning was in that year, what was working, what really wasn't working, what they wanted. And it was, the consensus was just overwhelming. Students just said, we need to return to in-person as soon as we possibly can. Like, this is, we see all the work that's happening where, you know, students really kept the college going during that period of time. And it was incredible. And also, it's not what we want long-term.
Thank you. There's a question here that we get all the time, and it often comes up in conversations with policymakers, especially, that I'm going to ask you, James, to weigh in on, especially as your role as a recruitment specialist now, which is about providing sort of skilled trades, nursing, plumbing, construction. Is there an argument to be made for prioritizing programs that would focus on employment? And I'm wondering if you might weigh in on your thoughts about the value of a liberal arts education as it relates to employability, particularly when people are thinking about formerly incarcerated folks, but as that translates to your work with the microcolleges as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't provide anything that would be a definitive answer about anything. These decisions, I think, really are best made individually, but I can speak about my experience with students that I encounter, students I know. So the education that they received in the college and prison isn't necessarily conducive to like being a plumber or an electrician or working as a contractor. And these are jobs, especially upon release, that are very attractive to formerly incarcerated people. They pay immediately, they pay well, they allow people to build a life where they didn't have before. But I think where you see the distinction with, you know, individuals who've gone to college and prison and received a liberal arts education is that they're a little bit more fluid, that they can see themselves, their role in society as not just, okay, I'm stuck in this job. So I think, you know, the benefits of providing a liberal arts education is they can't be quantified in terms of we have this many people at, you know, as CEOs, or we have this many people working in, you know, this industry. I think the benefits themselves are a little less tangible. And personally, I find them to be much more, I don't know, I guess I'm going to struggle for the word for it. I don't want to say it's something that comes across as magical, but it is something that definitely changes individual lives in like a real way that I don't think you'd be able to kind of grasp or project. So yeah, in terms of whether or not colleges and prisons should kind of see themselves as educational platforms that will eventually lead to employment or tie their curriculum to, the employment landscape of the United States. I think that might be one way to do it. I would hate to think that that's the only way to do it. And I know personally that the program that I graduated from doesn't see it that way. And I think they've been successful at that. So.
And I want to invite everyone else from the panel to chime in and as well in thinking about this distinction between employment in terms of trades and employability in terms of the liberal arts. Erin, I can tell you're ready to go. Jump in, please.
I just, for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the US context, this is a broader conversation in the field of higher ed, and it has been for a very long time, right? So this is not, I think it's, perhaps condensed or kind of highlighted in this particular space because so much political kind of, movement requires, we've got to make sure, that we're investing in appropriate ways, but we're not applying that same kind of scrutiny to non-incarcerated students. And so I would just say that I think part of the way forward, and I think Bard, you've done a phenomenal job. I think other kind of liberal arts-based programs are doing a great job too. We need all of these pathways. All of these pathways should be provided as choice. And I think the challenge we're at now is that that is just not happening in this space. We know that over 50% of all the pathways provided inside prisons are CTE vocational based. There's nothing wrong with CTE vocational-based education programming, but if you're only being overexposed to a particular kind of education, then the question becomes, why not other kinds of educational experiences? Why not provide people these various options? And I think that's really where I hope, to the question and the comment about how data is used, I hope we're able to use the data in that way as well, to kind of educate people on, there are other kinds of pathways that are available inside prisons, and why shouldn't we be doing this work?
Anybody else before I move on? I'm conscious of time. We have a couple more minutes. Megan, we talked, I think it was James who talked in the slide about the summer residency and the work we do, and especially I, in fact, do with sort of providing technical assistance for emerging practitioners in the United States and now beyond. There's a question about that asks about exporting the BARD model. And I just wanted to kind of prompt you to talk a little bit about how we would frame it and kind of respond to the idea of exporting the BARD model.
Yeah, so we have spent a lot of time over the last 5 years or more thinking about what have we learned that we would like to make useful to other people. And in that sense, we do want to be able to share the BARD model and have people take it and use it in ways that are useful to them. I think the word I would, that I don't see us doing is export, because that maybe suggests that we're taking something that's pre-made and trying to just put it in additional places. So, we really think fundamentally that the college needs to embody the mission and character and people of the institution, and the campuses that happen to be inside prison need to do that, as well as the campuses that are outside of prison. So we would never try to put BARD into another location where another college is operating. We want that college to think about what it would mean for them to really see students who are in prison as full students of the college, and what it would mean for them to offer their curriculum inside the prison in the way that they do outside of the prison. So we're very obviously proud of what we do and want to be able to share that expertise, and we also want people to use it in ways that make sense for them. I think that as we are now particularly interested in having these conversations internationally, that's even more the case, that we recognize the limitations of that so much of what we do is very specific. So how do we think about what we have learned and how that can be helpful to people who are operating in very different contexts from us? And that's really exciting to do.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes. Is there anything that anyone wants to just add that you just didn't quite, I don't want to leave anything off. So anything that you did, anyone wanted to just add right away. And then I see Frederick popping in, so we'll have him come in. But any last comments, closing thoughts?
I would just say there's a comment in the Q&A about the kind of discrimination against women in this space. And it's absolutely a thing. And while we do incarcerate more men, the only great answer I have is the patriarchy is why we start in male prisons. I will say a number of us who work at colleges and universities are constrained by how close prisons are. And so most of us kind of look geographically to start to say what is doable. And, you know, if that facility doesn't house folks assigned as male at birth and folks assigned as female at birth, we do end up where we're at now, which is a disproportionate overexposure for incarcerated men than women.
I think it also, I mean, this points out one of the, and there are many shortcomings in this field, so certainly a shortcoming, and perhaps as a way to close in a connection, you know, to the point, Megan, that you were making, this is a dynamic field. It's a growing, it's an emerging field. And Jessica, you really started this conversation suggesting that even the work of this landscape project really is like building this field and the community of practice. It's at a very early stage. Education has been part of prisons and the prison system for, you know, centuries of the United States, but really thinking about this work as a practice, as a field, is emerging. And so it is a dynamic practice. It is often site-specific, facility-specific, state-specific, but we do see patterns. And I think that's really what we're trying to point out in the landscape work. And Aaron, perhaps, you know, 2 really important patterns. One was the overrepresentation of CTE, vocational education. 2-year schools are overrepresented. We need to see more 4 years. We need to see more graduate. There's no reason you couldn't get a master's degree. And there are master's degrees, about 8 master's degree programs that we're tracking right now. We're not tracking in-person doctoral programs. There's a whole field of opportunity for educational access for students, and we need to see more of that. So I think that's perhaps where I would end the conversation, is the effort to track the growth and trajectory of this field is critical.
All right, then I'm gonna jump in right now to thank you all so much, Jessica, Megan, James, Mary, and Aaron, for sharing insightful thoughts and inspiring information about education, higher education in prison. I'm gonna take the last minute to welcome everyone in the audience to come to the next webinar, which will be held on March 9th, 2022 and the title provisionary is Learning Difficulties in Incarceration, Intersecting Perspectives from Switzerland and Quebec. Just a reminder for everyone, the recording of today's webinar will be on our YouTube channel in the weeks to come. The presentations, the PowerPoints that were shared will also be on our website. Once again, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to the audience, and I hope that was a pleasant webinar for everyone involved.